Welcome to the Shared Path. I'm Maggie Linton. Most everyone has heard of the Holocaust and the horrors that befell millions. Our next guest, award winning author Elena K. Arnold, shares her grandmother's young life in Holocaust era Romania with her latest novel, The Blood Years. Elena, thank you so much for joining us. This is a beautiful, moving story.
Thank you so much. It's actually Alana, but that's totally fine.
Alana, okay. I
Alana.
got I got it, Alana.
That's all right.
And it will
Yes.
be that way for the rest of the
No
time,
problem at
okay?
all. Yeah. I'm so grateful to be here to speak with you about my book, The Blood Years, as you said, which just came out today. Today is my book's birthday, and I'm just so glad to have this opportunity.
And what's so important is right now, it really relates to what's going on now in Israel and around the world. And we hear about, so many deaths and things like that. But the survivors and children in particular, how they are affected by it. And of
Yeah.
course, the guardians, the grandfathers, the parents, the nanas, the opas, who really are there to try and protect them.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's one thing that unites people across borders, across religions, across regions, across races, I think it's the desire to protect our young people. And that was something my grandmother tried to do for me, and she did in many ways. And it was something her grandfather did for her. And that's sort of one of the central love stories in this book is between the main character Frederica and her grandfather, who she calls Opa, who's based on my grandmother's grandfather, who was her protector.
As you look through it, your grandmother was a brilliant woman, wasn't
She
she?
was. Oh my
When you
gosh.
talk about the multiple languages and her just quest and love for survival.
Yeah, absolutely. She did. She loved being alive. Even though when she was younger, she didn't think she would get to stay alive. And I know when she was young, she was so ill. She suffered from tuberculosis through the war that she didn't even care always if she was going to stay alive because she was so sick and scared, and the region looked so hopeless. But then she was able to, she did survive, plot spoiler, and she was eventually came to this country. My father was born in Europe. We are the first generation to be born here, the grandchildren. And she was delighted by being a grandparent, by watching us become parents, by seeing her line continue. What a gift to be able to share her story through my book.
And as you let's go to your book because really you start out in one of the most basic ways is the timeline of
Mm-hmm.
what went on and we hear so much about Germany and some of the other countries, but we don't
Right.
hear as much about Romania and
Yeah.
how they kept changing, thinking they were going with the right group, and it wasn't always working out that way.
Yeah. You know, this area and many areas has long sort of hated the Jews. And with Hitler's rise to power, it sort of gave them a fresh reason to return to anti-Semitic hatred and violence. I wish I could say that the Holocaust was an aberration, but it isn't. It was sort of the loudest scream in a, a long history of screams, of violence against the Jewish people. And so, yeah, Romania kind of got on board with re-upping and elevating the violence towards its Jewish residents. Yeah, there's a timeline at the beginning of the book because things were so complicated. It was so hard for me to figure out what was happening. I remember when I was a kid, I was learning about the Holocaust. I knew my grandmother were Jewish, and like Nana, were you, in a concentration camp? And she's like, not exactly. What a strange answer, because the history in Romania was so specific. And we mostly hear stories about Poland. My grandfather was a Polish Jew. Unfortunately, most of his family perished in concentration camps. But the Holocaust, the horrors and the tragedies were regional too, and specific. And I think most storytelling really is in the specificity of the details. So this is a very specific story. It is a story set during the Holocaust. It's a Holocaust book, but it's also a family story, as you were saying about her grandfather. It's a story about what it means to be a sister. It's a story about dance. I really do think that this is a book about the great and terrible things that people do in the name of love.
And let's talk about Asta because her sister. You start right out with a love story, and in a sense, weaves its way through the whole novel. And, you see one person, Conrad, pining over here on the sides, really in love, but she's not really in love with him. And that's what
You
I,
know what? Yeah, it's such a pleasure to talk with someone who's read the book because the book just comes out today. Today is the pub date for this book. And so very few people have read it yet. And what a pleasure for me as a writer to get to talk with you about these characters that have lived in my head for so
yeah.
long. Yes, yeah, Astra, the older sister, is mercurial and mean and brilliant and talented. And the younger sister, who's based on my grandmother, Frederica, loves and hates her sister. There's a boy, Conrad, who plays piano, as you said, that is in love with Astra. He plays piano for their ballet troupe. And yeah, I mean, these things happen right in the middle of war. People fall in love, people get their first period, people experience heartbreak. These small family moments, they're given a watch by their grandfather, all happen under this giant umbrella of a war.
The other thing is culturally, the grandfather still wanted everyone to still pursue their dreams. And we forget about that sometimes too, because we think it's just war, 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 war. But there are those special moments where people are having the chance to kind of live normal lives.
Yeah. And I do think when things are terrible, it's so important to pay attention to the normal parts and the small, intimate, vulnerable beauties that do that are woven like threads through all of our lives. I think it's those moments that get people through the larger tragedies.
Let's talk about grandfather because he brings in his daughter and his two
Yeah,
granddaughters because of the circumstance of the mother. And you know, his daughter really suffers with depression
yeah.
and the fact that her husband is here, there, everywhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is all true. So my grandmother was the younger daughter of two girls. There's pictures in the back of the book of my
I
grandparent,
love them.
my relatives.
Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, my great grandmother, Anna, was a depressed woman whose husband came and went, as you said. He was a philanderer and a louse, and he sort of danced in and out of their lives as he pleased. But luckily, they had Heinrich Fishman, my great great grandfather, who was this sort of steady force in their lives and took them into his apartment where she was raised by her grandfather mostly. Which is really another sort of cycle because my grandmother and my grandfather, but especially my grandmother, were the people who were the most stable forces in my life. So she was able to repeat that cycle in a good way for me.
She also encouraged you with books, didn't she?
Mm-hmm. She
Yeah,
did.
that you can't learn enough. And that's what I tell young people all the time. Don't be afraid to learn.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think some grown-ups could probably, take from that advice too. Yeah, terrible, awful things happened in history to our ancestors, to our parents, on a bigger scale, both here in our country and obviously overseas. And I think there is sort of a movement to want to pretend these things didn't happen, to sort of look away, to ban voices, to want to tell stories that make people just feel good. But that creates a nation of perpetual ignorance. And it's terrifying to want to look away. It's more terrifying to want to look away from the terrible things, I think, than it is to pay attention to them and reckon with them.
It's the same thing with the Black experience. When I
Absolutely.
keep seeing, Jews and Blacks walk hand in hand with
Yeah.
the hatred that's continuing to bubble up
Yeah.
and the truth not wanting to be told. But
Yeah.
another thing I loved about your novel is you didn't flinch away from the horrors,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
let your your people experience everything.
Yeah.
And Marcel was a man who really dealt in truth, didn't he?
Oh, Marcel is such a great character. I love Marcel. So Marcel is older sister Astra's. She's obsessed with him. He's an older man. He's like her father in many ways. He's a doctor, and yeah, he sort of brings a new dynamic to the family when he begins to see the main character's older sister. Yeah, he is a truth teller in many ways, even as he's sort of a terrible man. One thing I really am proud of in this book is that there's almost nobody that is pure. There are people in the world probably that are pure good, and I know there are some people, maybe they didn't start off as pure evil, but they sure have managed to get there. But in this book, almost everyone is nuanced. Everyone is somewhere along that gray scale of good to bad. And sometimes the worst people do the best things, and sometimes the best people do the worst things. And I think that is a truth in life, is that it's not just bad guys and good guys almost always. There's nuance. And I do think that our country wants, in many ways lately, to flatten that nuance and to put people into containers and labels, and that really ends discussions. It's so interesting what you said about the Black experience and the Jewish experience. My grandmother, when she came to this country with my grandfather, they didn't land in Ellis Island. They landed in New Orleans because they knew they were coming to California. It was always their destination. So their boat dropped them off in New Orleans, and it was during segregation. So it was a terrible time. They got off the train, or off the plane, and it's a plane. Sorry, it's very early here in California. They got off the boat and they were in New Orleans, and they saw segregation. They saw, whites only signs, and they thought to them, I remember my grandmother saying to me, she thought, they were so worried, like, where have we come? Have we just entered the same thing we left? And then they came to California. Yeah, right. Everything is cyclical. Things were marginally better in California. At least the racism that Blacks were experiencing was less overt. It was certainly still obviously a problem with redlining and so many other issues. But she said that was a shocking moment when they thought they were coming to America, the land of the free, to see a whole part of the American people being treated in many ways like she felt they had been treated in Europe. So everything is cyclical and patterns repeat themselves, and it's important that we pay attention.
I grew up in, when you talked about the signs, I grew up in Kansas. The very first time I ever saw a colored only and white only signs were in 1960 when we went to my uncle's funeral in Georgia.
How old were you then?
Let's see, I was must have been about 13 years old.
Yeah.
And I was just like appalled.
Yeah. And I'm appalled hearing about it.
Yeah. But it was a reality that I had never. Kansas was a free state. I mean, yeah, there were parts that were always still a problem, but I grew up in an integrated neighborhood with Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Baptists, and we all got along. And so I understand truly what it's like to be treated as a second-class citizen, and I didn't like it at all.
No. I can't imagine you would. I know the times when I've had those experiences, less frequently, I'm sure, as an 80s, white kid in California than you experienced in the 60s as a Black woman. But yeah, there was a terrible feeling to be an outsider, to be placed into a category and be denied experiences. And unfortunately, everything is cyclical, and these same things are happening again and again in variations on a theme.
Very true. Let's talk about the neighbors, especially the Oppenheimers, who came and really, you find as you're suffering, there's sharing in whatever we can to help lift that suffering up.
Yeah. That was a fantastic set of characters to get to write, along with their wonderful cat, Mitzi. So animals are a huge part of my life. I'm surrounded by them all the time. So whenever I have an opportunity to put animals into books, I take it. And yeah, the Oppenheimers, some people who will always, sort of strap on their own feed bags first and make sure that their very self is cared for before they reach out across the hallway to their neighbors. So the Oppenheimers are a couple like that, who are very self-interested. But I do think that they add some sort of comedic lightness to the book, which, as a writer, when you're writing about something so historic and hard and dark, is very important to find opportunities for levity and joy. So they were definitely an opportunity for me there.
No, they also we have to talk about George too,
Oh,
because
George.
he was precious, and in a sense, he saved your grandmother's life.
Yeah, yeah. So he's a real person. People always want to know what is real in
Yes,
this book.
I did
George,
want to know.
yeah, no, I didn't include a picture of George, although I have one because I didn't want to give him that kind of permanence alongside my grandmother in this book. Yeah, George was when I talk about how this book is about the great and terrible things people do in the name of love. George Weisinger is one of those characters. Um, I think he truly did believe that what he did was out of love. And some of the things he did were life saving, and some of the things he did were terribly life altering. Um, I don't know what to say about George, except that as someone who myself grew up with incidences of sexual violence, having my grandmother tell me her story um, felt like a gift because she came through, I wouldn't say unscathed at all, but with she retained um, a joy.
Optimism. And
Yeah,
joy. Yeah.
yeah, a joy of being alive. My grandmother was delighted by animals and delighted by life. And I think that ambiguity, that ability to be delighted in the midst of understanding that things can be really, truly terrible. And it's not that everything's going to turn out okay, it's that good and bad exist all the time at the same moment. And not finding ways to ignore the bad, but finding ways to also enjoy and to grab hold like Astra does, to grab hold of life while you can, um, is one of the things that I so admire about my grandmother and her sister also.
The thing is, in a sense, George, was there one time when you need to buy food, but at the same time, he's the one who insisted that your and he and Marcel insisted that your grandmother go to the hospital and really find out what's wrong with her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. There are no, like I said, there are no characters really in this book, in the small family version of this book, that are purely
Yeah.
good or purely bad. Um, in fact, there's a whole other book I could write about my grandmother and George and Astrid and Astra and all of those characters. What happens after this book ends? There's at least another book's worth of material. I could spend the rest of my life writing about my grandmother.
Well, I was saying, as the train pulls off, let's hear more. you know,
Yeah, no, yeah, yeah.
it's
Jews on trains is not usually a good thing, for
yes.
sure. And not everything that happens after that train leaves the station at the end of the book, I don't want to give anything away, is purely good or
Mhm.
either. So things, I mean, my grandmother obviously lived to tell me her story. So that is one of my favorite things about this book was the ability to include a picture of my grandmother as I remember her at the very end of the book, waving happily and standing safely behind her gate. She loved having a gate with a lock.
Mhm. And there are a lot of homes like that, especially, not just in California, but in many locations, the
Yeah.
security that's there. One of
Yeah.
the other people we just have to give a little bit more nod to is Conrad,
Oh no.
because he was such a sweet soul.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
other than his love for Astra, he was just a good person.
Yeah. So, yeah, so Conrad is the pianist at the Astra and Frederica's ballet studio. And he's also the older brother of Frederica's best friend, Esther Glassman. And he was, it was interesting actually. He was a character that came to me later in the process. This book went through 7 full drafts over a series of about 10 years. And Conrad's character was very small and grew as the book went through its iterations until he ultimately becomes such an important character in the book, even though he's only in a handful of scenes. They're pivotal ones.
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
very much they are. And you show how cruel people can be to each
Mm-hmm.
other. Kind of
Yeah.
oh, what's life? And
Yeah.
we see it happen way too often, especially I have to say now with young people and the gun violence that
Yeah.
goes on. It's like if you could if I could give each one of them just to show them the effects it would be worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, life is so precious and it's we're so lucky to exist, you know? If we're lucky, each one of us gets 100 years, you know, if we're lucky. And then it's over. Like um that lasts, you know, oblivion is hasn't doesn't have an expiration date, you know. There was oblivion before we were here and there will be oblivion after, but we have this 100 years of consciousness, and to do anything that shortens our ability to exist is just a tragedy for me. I'm mostly I write, my books are written and published as young adult novels, and one thing I really do hope that teens take from my book is how vitally beautiful it is to have the privilege of existing, even amidst terrible things. You know, not because life is beautiful and perfect and the bad thing will end and then everything will be happily ever after. That's not my books. But because existing is a privilege. And one can embrace it, even the pain.
You know, and you talk about the pain, and I think about all the different food banks and things that there are around the world, and we hear of kids being able going to school to really get the meals that will help sustain their families.
Yeah.
And you really talk about that too. Again, an awakening that still exists for so many people. The shortages, the as they call them, the food deserts that are around this country and around the world.
Yeah. Sometimes I think Americans, we like to pretend that we are beyond, you know, some of these problems, so that they are other people's problems or different times problems. But like you said, there are food deserts right here in our own country. There's book deserts too, where, you know, kids don't have access to literature, and these are not problems from another time or another place. They continue. They're just maybe take um, a slightly different look, but the same problems persisting.
Right. Okay. One of the statements you made in there is, why is God not taking care of his people? And
Mm-hmm.
that his people are supposed to be all of us. And
Mm-hmm.
how can he allow such cruel things? And I thought, what a wonderful statement. It was just there,
Mm-hmm.
in the
Yeah.
asking,
Yeah.
um, but why?
Yeah. I wish I had answers to those questions too.
Mhm.
I think that's actually my job as a novelist, isn't to give answers, but it's to wrestle with questions,
Right.
which is actually, you know, very Jewish of me. Uh, the questions and the wrestling with the questions is core to who I am, and I think staying curious and looking for answers, even if they're unfindable, is a unique human privilege and pleasure. And I know when I was growing up, you know, I would sit around the table with my grandmother for hours and we would just talk and we'd ask questions and we would drink tea and eat cookies and then we'd talk more and would laugh. And I would have people come over and they would say, "You sit around, you just sit at the table for like 4 hours. What do you do?" It's like, "Well, what do you mean? This is how you live a life." And I really do think that uh, young people maybe are missing opportunities if they aren't sitting with their parents and their grandparents and asking questions. One of my favorite sentences is "I wonder." Um, it's such a great way to find a story as a novelist, to simply just wonder. And it's such an interesting way to get to know your family and yourself better as well. So yeah, this book started with a lot of wonder for me, in all of the meanings of the word, actually. And part of that wondering is wondering about why we're here. Is there a God? If there is a God, how could such terrible things happen? Um, if there isn't a God, is there still meaning? Do we create meaning, or is meaning thrust upon us? These are big questions. How could anyone be tired of asking them?
Yeah. And I agree with you about kids needing to sit around and talk to elders, friends,
Yeah,
family, and learn that, the world that they live in right now was worked hard and many debts
yeah,
paid in order for this to happen.
yeah.
And their phone is not their best friend.
I agree. And I think that the grown-ups owe them something too. I think that their grown-ups owe them vulnerability and honesty. And I know that there's this real desire to sort of protect children by not telling them the hard things. And we see that now with people wanting to remove books like that make white kids uncomfortable about race, and we see these sort of terrible erasures of truth because people want to just look, they just want to look good in their stories, even like on a familial level. Maybe you don't tell your kid about the time you got really drunk sophomore year and almost, killed yourself in your car because you want them to see you as a hero. But one gift my grandmother gave me is she gave me vulnerability. She didn't always have to be the hero in her stories. So she became this full, round, rich person that I was fascinated by. So I do think that if we want our young people to be interested in our stories, we need to tell them in the full sort of beautiful, terrible truth, and not need to try to seem like we're the hero of the story necessarily, and not protect them from the hard parts. I think people have this idea that protecting a child's innocence is this grand virtue, but I think protecting innocence and fostering ignorance are very close, and we need to pay attention to when we are going from one into the other. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of fostering of ignorance that is happening because people don't want to say the hard things.
Normally, I ask somebody, what's your final statement? But you just gave it. And
I'll take it.
I can't say I agree with you 100%. So I know you've got more to go to, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this beautiful book. And I know your grandmother gave you the name for the lead character, and
She
you've
did,
done her
yes.
proud.
Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. I really do feel like I did a good job and that my grandmother would be proud of me and delighted that her story, as painful as it was, is going to be shared, I hope, very widely. And I so appreciate, what a pleasure to talk with someone who has read the book and knows and loves the characters. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really do hope that this book will find its readership, The Blood Years. And thank you for helping me help the book.
I'm going to do everything I can to help make it happen.
I appreciate that deeply. Thank you.
Continued blessings.
Thank
Many
you.
thanks to award-winning author, let me get this name right, Elena. Am I right?
Elena.
Lana. Oh, okay. I messed it up. Many thanks to award-winning author Elena K. Arnold. I was so glad to get a chance to talk with her. Her latest novel is one not to be missed. It is The Blood Years. It is one of the best reads I've had in a while. More on her many books, writing classes, and events at her website, elenakarnold.com. Until next time, seek peace and spread lots of love. I'm Maggie Linton.